there are, I want to look at four sort of broad areas. One is, we've had a lot of discussion lately. Of course, we've got the first Pentecostal leader, I believe, the first Pentecostal leader in the English-speaking world, which is, of course, our very own Scott Morrison. And there's been a lot of media discussion about what that might mean and what significance that might bear for the shape of religion politics or Christianity politics interactions in Australia. And so I'll talk a bit about what I think about that. I'd be interested to hear what you think as well. And as well as the Prime Minister, of course, there's other politicians. We can think about the significance of the way that Christianity affects the political scene more broadly. And then there's, as well as politicians, there's Christian political activism outside of Parliament. And there's also the question of policy, the way that Christian churches and parachurch organisations work at the level of policy. So first of all, thinking about the Prime Minister, the faith of the Prime Minister is something that when I was kind of having my political formation at the time of that photo that Michael showed in the late 80s and early 90s, it was very, very unusual for Australian Prime Ministers to really mention anything about their faith or about their religious convictions. And that was kind of regarded as almost kind of a bit sleazy to talk about, or a bit, like too American to talk about that aspect of a Prime Minister's life. And it's become more and more part of Australian political discourse, and people often talk about the Americanisation of Australian politics with more of a focus on personalities and more of a interest in the private lives in all sorts of respects, and interest in the religious lives and religious beliefs of our leaders is one aspect of that. But it's not only a shift towards a more Americanised or more celebritisation of political life, but also it has been partly driven by the leaders themselves. And of course, a big push of mover and shaker of that change was John Howard, who in office described himself not as a regular churchgoer or a regular practitioner. In fact, he used to say that religion was only a very small part of his life when he was in office. But Scott Morrison, by contrast, but Howard, although he described religion as only a small part of his life, he made religious allusions and religious positioning a significant part of his political persona. Scott Morrison is different. Scott Morrison has gone out of his way to have himself photographed in church, to talk about his faith, to talk about himself as a religious person. And so he said things like, "I have always believed in miracles," he said, when he won the 2019 election. And he's often narrated the story of how one of his daughters was conceived after his eldest daughter was conceived after a long period of infertility and struggling to conceive. And then finally, after they'd given up trying, she was conceived on the 7th of the 7th, 2007. And Annabelle Crabb was interviewing him and said, do you think God changed his mind? And Scott Morrison said, "No, I don't think he changed his mind. I think that was a message to me about who's in charge." So he kind of narrates quite very, very, very personal things like even the formation of his family as acts of divine intervention, giving specific messages from God about specific things. When he and these are things that he's made very public, like he makes them a public part of his political persona. And before he took the leadership of the Liberal Party, he not only prayed himself but got his parliamentary colleagues, his closest colleagues, and his family to pray from book of Proverbs, chapter 14, that righteousness will exalt the nation. He's talked about his calling to be Prime Minister using the verse from the book of Esther, for such a time as this. So he is not shy at all about kind of expressing his prime ministership or his understanding of his public role in quite theological terms, even though he doesn't like to be pressed about it and he doesn't like to be asked questions about it, but he likes to kind of express it in his own terms. So he is quite a kind of a change from the way that earlier prime ministers have talked about faith and their place in public life. When there was quite a bit of discussion about these sorts of expressions by Scott Morrison, a student said to me, well, wouldn't any, because Scott Morrison had said something about feeling himself called to do God's work in the prime ministership. And a student said to me, well, wouldn't any Christian who finds himself in a position of leadership think of themselves as doing God's work? You know, what's really actually so remarkable about that? And so I've sort of been pondering that ever since. And I kind of concluded there are different ways that a person might think about that expression or that idea of being called to do God's work in a particular position, and especially a position of national leadership like the prime ministership. And one way would be to say, well, this is where I find myself by the will of the people, having been elected to this position, and I have to really hope that I'm doing God's will and try my hardest not to stuff it up, because we're all fallen. You know, that would be one theological way of framing it. Another theological way of framing it would be to think, I've been put here by God, and so whatever I do more or less is kind of almost by definition going to be God's will. That, like, God has put me here and that makes it God's will, what I'm doing. So there's kind of a spectrum of ways that one might think about what doing God's will in a position of leadership means. And the verses that Morrison invokes when he talks about his particular interpretation of leadership, I think it's reasonable to say that they incline not right to the whatever I do is God's will line, but they sort of, he has a sense of, seems to reflect a sense of having a more particular kind of calling to the role. For such a time as this, the verse from the book of Esther recalls the idea of a particular person being put by God into a particular position to do for a task. So the way that our current Prime Minister talks about himself as in relation to his faith is quite different from the way that previous Prime Ministers that we've had in Australia have done so. We've had a series of quite articulated, so I said that Howard was a sort of a departure on the part of Australian Prime Ministers in bringing faith to the forefront, but not his own faith particularly, because he didn't describe himself as a particularly religious person, but making religious allusions in his speeches and positioning himself in relation to religious organisations. But then we've had a series of other leaders. So Kevin Rudd was a very committed, religiously committed leader, and Tony Abbott. So it's not an unusual thing for recent Australian Prime Ministers both to be religiously committed and to talk about it, but they've talked about it in each of them have had distinctively different ways of talking about it, and Scott Morrison's is a different one again.